The stillness of a secluded lake at dusk is a feeling I've always associated with peace. It's a specific kind of quiet, broken only by the cast of a line and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. For many of us, fishing isn't just a hobby. It's a form of meditation, a way to disconnect from the noise of the world and reconnect with something more primal and serene. But what happens when that serenity is shattered not by a sudden catch, but by something you can't explain? What happens when the water, a place of life and sustenance, reveals a darker, more predatory side? The stories I'm about to share with you aren't campfire tales designed for a cheap scare. They are first-hand accounts from ordinary people who went out for a day of fishing and returned with experiences that have fundamentally altered their perception of nature, and perhaps of reality itself. When you line these narratives up, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge, one that suggests that in the forgotten, isolated corners of our world, something waits beneath the surface, and its intentions are far from clear. The first account comes from two brothers who had turned a private lake into their personal sanctuary. This wasn't a popular fishing spot. It required a hike through the woods, a fact they appreciated because it guaranteed their solitude. Their ritual was a simple one. They'd arrive just as the sun was setting, bypassing the conventional dawn fishing trip for the tranquility of night. It was their substitute for the parties and social chaos of high school, a way to bond away from prying eyes. On this particular Friday night, everything was proceeding as it had hundreds of times before. They were settled on a familiar formation of rocks, their lines baited and in the water, the last light of day fading from the sky. It was then that movement on the far side of the lake caught their eye. The sheer size of the rippling water suggested something substantial had taken them a surprisingly long time to notice. As they strained to see across the sizable lake in the low visibility, a dark mass began to rise from the water. Their initial assumption of a large fish was immediately dispelled. The shape was too big, too upright. The chilling realization dawned on them simultaneously. It was a person. The strangeness of that fact alone was enough to quicken their pulses. A person in their private lake, after sunset, who had just been completely submerged for an extended period. The figure began to sway back and forth in the water, its movements not jerky or panicked, but perfectly fluid and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. They abandoned their fishing poles, their attention completely captured by the bizarre sight. They tried to rationalize it, a night swimmer. But a touch of the water confirmed it was freezing cold, far too cold for any sane person to be enjoying a swim. After a few minutes of this silent, swaying observation, the person submerged again. The brother JJ had the presence of mind to start a stopwatch on his phone. As the seconds ticked past 1 minute, then 2, their astonishment grew. Holding one's breath for nearly 3 minutes in freezing water is a superhuman feat. Just before the 3-minute mark, ripples appeared again, but this time, they were dramatically closer, only a fifth of the way across the lake. The person had not only held their breath for an impossibly long time, but had swum a significant distance entirely underwater. This was the breaking point. As they stood to leave, the figure emerged again, now close enough to see clearly. It was a young woman with long brown hair, wearing a dark green swimsuit. She was, by the brothers' own admission, kind of beautiful, which somehow made the situation more unsettling, disarming their immediate fear. She flashed an alluring smile and said, her demeanor playful and coy, as if she hadn't just performed a physiological impossibility. When they asked what she was doing, she simply said, swimming, and when pressed, teased them with a something like that. Then came the invitation, the moment where the bizarre curdled into genuine horror. She asked them if they wanted to join her. When they refused, calling her crazy for suggesting they enter the freezing water, her playful facade vanished. She called them babies and then fell silent, glaring at them with a finger on her lip. It was this shift, this cavalier attitude combined with an icy look in her eyes, that set off every internal alarm bell. As they gathered their things to leave, she screamed, "No," at the top of her lungs. The scream was so shocking it caused them to stumble backward. They began to run, and as they did, she continued screaming for them to come back, to get in the water. Then, the screams devolved into pure, wordless shrieking, a sound they described as resembling someone being stabbed. They could still hear her horrific cries as they fled halfway back to their car. They called the police but were too terrified to stay. They did eventually return to the lake, bringing their father for protection, but they never saw the woman again. The easy, comfortable explanation is mental illness. But that label feels inadequate, a flimsy bandage placed over a gaping wound of questions. How did she withstand the cold? How did she hold her breath and swim like that? Her actions seemed less like the erratic behavior of an unwell person and more like a deliberate, predatory lure. She wasn't just there, she was fishing. And they were the prey. The second story transports us from a cold northern lake to the humid, murky marshes of Louisiana. Here the horror wasn't a visible, human-like figure. but something entirely unseen, something that operated from the concealing depths of the muddy water. The narrator, an avid fisherman named Jay, was out with his equally obsessed friend, Angel, in a two-person kayak. They were targeting speckled trout in the shallow marshes, a familiar and cherished pastime. The peace of the day was shattered when Angel, reeling in a fish, leaned over too far and watched in horror as his phone slid from his jacket pocket and disappeared into the murky water. The water was so turbid that visibility was just a few inches, making a visual search impossible. After 20 futile minutes of probing the muddy bottom with their paddles, a frustrated and desperate Angel made a decision. He stripped off his shoes and pants and waded into the marsh. The water was deeper than expected, about 4.5 feet, and brutally cold, but Angel was determined to find his phone by feeling for it with his feet. Jay watched from the kayak, knowing his friend couldn't withstand the cold for long. Then, without warning, Angel yelled out and his whole body was violently flipped forward, completely submerged. Jay's first thought was that Angel had slipped or perhaps dove for the phone. But seconds passed, and Angel did not resurface. As Jay frantically began removing his own shoes to jump in, Angel suddenly burst back to the surface, covered in filth and mud. Screaming at Jay to get out of there as fast as possible, they hauled him back into the kayak and paddled away with a frantic, terrified energy. Angel was shaking uncontrollably, and not just from the cold. He kept looking back at the water, expecting something to be following them. Once they were a safe distance away, he recounted what happened. While he was feeling around with his feet, something had grabbed his ankle. It wasn't a hand, he said. It wasn't a tentacle or a set of jaws. It was just something that wrapped around his ankle with incredible, unyielding strength. When he was pulled under, this force tried to drag him away from the spot, deeper into the marsh. He fought with every ounce of his strength, kicking and struggling until he finally managed to break free. Jay, trying to rationalize the event, suggested a large catfish or an alligator gar. But Angel, a seasoned fisherman who knew the local wildlife, was adamant. What grabbed him did not feel like any fish or animal he had ever encountered. The description of a formless, powerful grip is somehow more terrifying than a recognizable monster. An alligator gar is a known quantity. It has teeth a shape of biology we can understand. This was an oot, an unknown entity whose only defining characteristic was a powerful dragging intent. This encounter leaves a different kind of mark than the first. It's not about a lure or an invitation. It's about a direct, physical assault from an unseen predator. It suggests that in certain waters, the mud itself can reach up and grab you. The third and final story brings the horror closer to home, to a classic teenage hangout spot, a secluded reservoir near a friend's neighborhood. It was a place of minor rebellion, accessed through a hole cut in a chain link fence. Past no trespassing signs they treated as a joke. For the narrator and his friends, Nick, Megan, and Kat, it was their perfect hidden beach. On this evening, they were setting up for a night of casual fishing, drinking, and music. The vibe was shattered when Kat pointed out something they had never seen before: a canoe, wedged oddly into the reeds further down the shoreline. Driven by curiosity, Nick and the narrator went to investigate. What they found was a scene of profound and unsettling abandonment. The canoe wasn't just old or derelict, it looked as if its occupant had vanished just moments before. A fishing rod lay with its line still in the water. A tackle box was open, as if someone had been in the middle of selecting a lure. There was a half-eaten sandwich, still wrapped. And most chilling of all, a cell phone was sitting on the seat, locked but with its flashlight turned on, casting a feeble beam. This was the detail that transformed the scene from curious to deeply wrong. People might run from trespassing and leave behind a rod or a tackle box, but no one short of a life or death emergency voluntarily abandons their phone. It is our modern-day lifeline. Its deliberate placement, or its forgotten state, suggested a sudden and violent interruption. The two young men felt a rising sense of foreboding as they returned to their friends and relayed what they had found. As they were discussing it, Megan gasped and pointed across the reservoir. There, on the far shore, standing knee-deep in the water, was a person. They were perfectly still, facing them, holding something long that could have been a rod or a stick. The most terrifying part was the realization that this person had been standing there, silently watching them the entire time they were investigating the canoe. The creepiness of the abandoned canoe instantly crystallized into pure, unadulterated fear. They needed no discussion, they began packing up to leave. And that's when the watcher broke his silence. He started screaming at them, a belligerent, lunatic's rant, telling them they shouldn't be there and to get out. This in itself was frightening, but logical. They were trespassing after all. But then the situation escalated into a nightmare. The man dropped what he was holding and strode purposefully into deeper water. He was swimming. He was swimming directly across the reservoir towards them. The four friends didn't wait another second. They sprinted for the hole in the fence, fueled by pure adrenaline. The narrator, the last one through, could hear the frantic splashing of the swimmer closing the distance as he scrambled to safety. They escaped, but the questions lingered, more haunting than any answers. Was the swimmer the owner of the canoe? If so, why was his canoe on one side of the reservoir while he was on the other? Why was he in the water? Or, and this is the thought that truly chills the blood, had the swimmer done something to the canoe's original owner? The abandoned phone, the half-eaten sandwich. They point to a victim. The silent, watching man, who then pursued them with such aggressive, single-minded fury, points to a predator. This story is perhaps the most socially grounded of the three, and therefore the most frightening. It blurs the line between a human threat and something more. The swimmer's behavior was feral, territorial, and utterly inhuman in its relentless pursuit. When you analyze these three stories together, the common threads are impossible to ignore. Each event occurs in an isolated body of water, a secluded lake, a remote marsh, a trespasser-only reservoir. In each case, the entity encountered is intrinsically linked to the water, almost as if it is an extension of the environment itself. The woman in the lake moved with a fluid, hypnotic grace, as if commanding the water. The thing in the marsh was formless, a grip from the mud itself. The man at the reservoir emerged from his silent, stationary observation to move through the water with terrifying purpose. Furthermore, the nature of the interaction follows a disturbing gradient. The first story is an invitation, a siren's call using allure and beauty as bait, which turns to rage when the bait is refused. The second story is an assault, a direct physical attempt to capture and drag its victim down. The third story is of a confrontation, a territorial defense that involves stalking and a violent chase. It's a pattern of escalation from lure to capture to attack. You can try to explain each one away individually. A mentally ill woman, a large misunderstood fish, an angry local. But the cumulative weight of these accounts, their structural similarities, makes that position feel willfully naive. It suggests that these are not isolated incidents, but glimpses of a phenomenon that exists at the edges of our understanding. These are not just stories about scary things in the water. They are stories about the violation of a sanctuary. For these individuals, the peace they sought in nature was irrevocably shattered, replaced by a deep-seated unease and the haunting knowledge that the surface of the water is merely a veil, and what lies beneath may be watching, waiting, and wanting. The next time you find yourself alone by a quiet, dark body of water, and you feel that primal sense of peace, remember these accounts. Listen a little more closely to the sounds of the water. Look a little more carefully at the far shore, because the solitude you cherish might not be solitude at all. It might be the stage before the performance begins, and you might not be the fisherman, you might be the fish.